exhausted majority is a group that makes up about 2/3 of the American population. They're more flexible in their views. They're not necessarily ideologically committed to one side or the other. They're frustrated with political division. They want to see both sides find common ground. And they tend to be less active in the political conversation. They're not as likely to voice their views on social media. They're not as likely to get in arguments with their friends about politics. Um, but yet they represent this sort of potent political force because they just represent so many of us in America right now. And one thing that David Brooks wrote is that he said, the exhausted majority has no philosophical narrative. They have no coherent worldview to compel their thinking and guide action. And when they get one, I suspect it will look totally different from the viewpoints that are on offer today. And so that line really stuck with me. It really made me think, like, what is the ethic of the exhausted majority? What is a unifying set of ideological principles that the exhausted majority can be committed to that's not defined in the negative, not defined what they're not. It's not like, oh, we're not the extremes on the progressive side or the conservative side. What are we? And so it's an effort to offer a positive, unifying vision for this otherwise politically homeless group of people.
I'm Laura Forcum, president of the Independent Center and a former marketing professor.
I'm Lauren Hall, professor of political science and author of the Substack, The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life.
This is We Made This Political, a podcast about making politics more about flourishing and less about power.
We talk about living together in families, communities, and as citizens, drawing from our backgrounds in psychology and political science, and as parents. Hey, everyone. We are absolutely thrilled to have Daniel Yudkin with us today. Laura's going to do a bio, and then we're going to jump right in.
Hey, so Daniel is the founding director of the Beacon Project, which is part of More in Common. And More in Common, if you aren't familiar with it, is an organization doing some really cool research, especially psychological research on the issue of combating political polarization. And just in general, working to create united, inclusive, and resilient societies, not only in the US, but also abroad. Daniel has a really interesting background. Not only does he have a PhD in social psychology from NYU, he has done a stint as a jazz pianist studying in France, and he taught school in Nicaragua. So I assume you're at least trilingual. You can tell us how many other languages you have.
Little rusty.
Traveled a long way to get here. Welcome.
Right. Thanks.
So give us a language count. 3, 4.
Well, yeah. I mean, I would say I'm like a 6 out of 10 on French and probably like a 3 or 4 out of 10 on Spanish these days. But definitely like to a couple days in either country and you kind of slip back into it. So
Yeah. Awesome. Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we are absolutely thrilled. I had the pleasure of hearing you give sort of some preliminary research recently, and then I think we've been at a couple other conferences together in different capacities. But why don't you actually just start by telling our listeners a little bit more about you and what the Beacon Project does, because this is, I think, really important work.
Sure. So as Laura said, I'm a social psychologist. My background is in moral decision making. So how people decide between right and wrong, and then the implications those decisions have for everything from their own lives to how to make a good organization, and then also sort of the societal or political implications of moral decision making. I've been working with More in Common since about 2017, and I helped lead some of our early research that was using kind of lenses from social psychology to better understand our polarized political landscape. And so we ended up doing a study called Hidden Tribes, which basically used a process called clustering to better understand how people's core beliefs can be different across the political spectrum. And so core beliefs include things like their moral values, their group identity, their sense of threat, and their beliefs about agency and responsibility. And so we use that approach to show that there is the American political landscape is actually far different from the sort of us versus them, red versus blue, liberal versus conservative, but actually made up of these 7 different tribes that span on the spectrum from political progressive activists on the far left side of the spectrum all the way to devoted conservatives on the far right. And so since that study came out in 2018, we've been doing a bunch of different research trying to dive into what are some of the other ways that we can understand this landscape, and how can we use some of these insights to make a better, healthier, more cohesive society and democracy. And so what the Beacon Project represents is kind of like the blue sky element of that work. The Beacon Project is saying, okay, we have all of this data that we've collected over the past almost 10 years now. We have a better understanding of our political dynamic, what's going on in the country. Can we use those insights to really offer new ways of thinking about what it means to live and work together in the 21st century, and what would the nature of the social contract be that can kind of address the challenges that we're facing as a society? And so this is kind of the work that we're focusing on now, is to offer, forward-looking and new solutions, new ideas, new concepts to try to make sense of the world that we're living in and offer a kind of a path forward.
Cool. So you're the founding director of Beacon Senate or Beacon Project. I assume that this was your brainchild. Can you tell us like what made you think that there's a need for this, and what your vision is for it? I like what you're describing as it's blue sky, forward looking. Beacon seems like the lighthouse right on the coast.
Yeah.
Could you say more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I was actually inspired. So when Hidden Tribes first came out, David Brooks wrote an article about this in the New York Times. And one of the things that we discovered as part of the Hidden Tribes was this group that we call the Exhausted Majority. The Exhausted Majority is a group that makes up about 2/3 of the American population. They're more flexible in their views. They're not necessarily ideologically committed to one side or the other. They're frustrated with political division. They want to see both sides find common ground. And they tend to be less active in the political conversation. They're not as likely to voice their views on social media. They're not as likely to get in arguments with their friends about politics. But yet they represent this sort of potent political force because they just represent so many of us in America right now. And one thing that David Brooks wrote is that he said, the exhausted majority has no philosophical narrative. They have no coherent worldview to compel their thinking and guide action. And when they get one, I suspect it will look totally different from the viewpoints that are on offer today. And so that line really stuck with me. It really made me think, like, what is the ethic of the exhausted majority? What is a unifying set of ideological principles that the exhausted majority can be committed to, that's not defined in the negative, not defined what they're not. It's not like, oh, we're not the extremes on the progressive side or the conservative side. What are we? And so it's an effort to offer a positive, unifying vision for this otherwise politically homeless group of people.
Well, so there's obviously a lot of overlap. I run a Substack on radical moderation. That's sort of in a probably less scientifically rigorous way, trying to do something similar, which is sort of lay out like how people can think about political moderation, social moderation, in a way that isn't just sort of compromise, meeting in the middle. And then Laura's work with the Independence Center, they've obviously done a lot of research recently on sort of the things that people have in common. And as I sort of started playing in this space, one of the things that I was really heartened by was how much sort of there is in common in this, like the exhausted majority, they're exhausted. That's the bad news. But the good news is that there actually is a lot that that I think people share in common. And there's like one of the major things, of course, is a desire for something better, right? I'm sure you know Anthony Fowler's work. He's a political scientist at University of Chicago, but he had a piece. It's an academic piece. We'll link to it in the show notes. But basically looking at sort of the standard social science take on moderates is like they're just sort of like they just sort of waffle back and forth, right? They like
uninformed.
They're unsophisticated, right? Like we like to use these kinds of phrases. But one of the things that his piece on, and it's a co-authored piece, there's a number of other authors, but one of the things that piece did that I think was so powerful is it said, hey, look, like if you ask people binary questions, you're going to get binary answers. But if you ask people much more rich and thoughtful and complex questions about the political and social world that they inhabit, it turns out you actually get richer and more thoughtful answers. And so that was sort of like a poke at the social scientists who are, because like what we do is we tend to ask people like, are you pro-choice? Are you pro-life? Like, do you consider yourself Democrat or Republican? Like we have the tendency, especially when it comes to larger quantitative work, we tend to ask people binary questions because it's an easy way of dealing with the data. But I think it actually does a lot of harm when it comes to trying to understand what most Americans are really trying to do. So it sounds like it's all sort of in this space, the same kind of space of trying to find new narratives that are there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would love to see that paper. I have not seen that.
I'll shoot it to you.
I'll
Yeah.
have to check it out. But yeah, that's exactly right. I think that like there's a sort of a poverty of imagination, especially, it's compounded by the two-party system and, this effort to kind of categorize people into one of two buckets. And those buckets tend to be defined oftentimes by their more extreme voices anyway. And so what you have are a lot of people that are a little bit more nuanced and that recognize the sort of moral complexities of different issues. They're torn, they're conflicted, and it's not like they're not opinionated. It's just that they are sometimes not sure exactly what the right answer is, because sometimes it's actually these issues are really complicated and difficult. So the sort of North Star here is, can we offer a framework that can ground some of these principles and really sort of build a philosophical foundation that can be used to refer back to and can give sort of guiding ideas about what the right policy should be in a way that's not necessarily succumbing to some of the more political extremes.
Going back to what you were saying about the unifying ideology, I spend a lot of time in my work talking to people about what that ideology might look like, because one of the questions people have a lot for independents and people in the space is, great, so what do you guys all agree on? What's the litmus test going to be? I get that all the time. And I sort of decline to be the person to write the litmus test. But one of the things that I hear, and that I hear in all kinds of quarters, is that the litmus test might be something around human dignity, or even human agency, right? And so like, that's one of the reasons we were so excited to talk about your latest piece of research, because what these people all agree on is kind of this vision of like, we need to respect people's ability to make decisions for themselves. Like that's important to their well-being as an individual, and it makes us better off as a society. And I think that's one of the things that exasperates them so much with the extremes of the two parties. That's what they don't want to be part of, is this like, I study mind attribution and mind denial. They don't want to be part of dehumanizing other people. And it sounds like, how could that possibly be a delimiter for a political group, right? Like, don't we all agree other people should be treated with dignity? And I think in 2025, the answer is apparently not. So I think there's tremendous potential for that to be part of the uniting one of the key uniting values for independence, or just for this exhaustive majority you're talking about?
That's fascinating. I would actually love to do a deep dive into the kinds of things that you're hearing from people, because I mean, the way you're talking about it just aligns so uh cl- with the direction some of our thinking is going. This idea of agency is so interesting because it's it's a very nuanced topic. It's agency, the idea of agency, responsibility, our authorship of our actions, our ability to make choices, has been used in the past to um, lay blame at the feet of victims of circumstance,
Hmm.
and to justify policies that were regressive in their consequences, and were used to sort of like um, justify washing your hands of
Hmm.
social responsibility to help people that are not doing well, because it was sort of their fault. And so one of the interesting thing about this is that what that has amounted to on the left is a deep suspicion of any effort or narrative that uses words like agency or responsibility, because of this historical association or connotations with victim blaming narratives. Then I think that's actually a mistake, because I don't know, we can get into this maybe later, but what our research shows is that the vast majority of Americans of all demographic groups
Right.
um, really hold an abiding faith in people's ability to make choices that improve their lives. And um, and they see it all, going back to this idea of dignity. Part of dignity is offering people or seeing people as agents.
Mhm.
And and so um there's a real like I think there's a missed opportunity on the left when it comes to sort of like a a uh a complete uh skepticism of any narrative that includes notions of agency or responsibility. And at the same time, right, those any story of agency or responsibility needs to be tempered with a story of opportunity. What are the ways that we can give people the opportunity to exercise agency in ways that improve their lives? And so there's really a sort of a, a fine balancing act that needs to happen here. But I think that neither side is really doing that. They're kind of leaning into the either or. And that, I think, is where the opportunity is, because when you actually talk to Americans, like, they see the complexity of it and they want a story that acknowledges that complexity.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, so uh, one of the things we try to do on this podcast is sort of show the overlap between, or like the connections between politics and parenting. And this is one that I think there's a huge one, right? So it's not just like the left, I think, overcorrected. I think they also were sort of pushing back against like how humans actually work. And one of the things I found really fascinating, I have 3 school age kids, and one of the things that we see a lot now is the sort of this growth mindset, you know, discussion. And so my kids are constantly sort of having their teachers question, right? Like, you're not good at math yet, right? Like, so having them
Mm.
question their own narratives about sort of how they, how they can work through the world, and making sure that any limitations they have or they think they have are understood as sort of temporal limitations, right? They can work through it with the right support. And
Yeah.
so I think what we know from like positive psychology is that when you tell people they don't have agency, you get really bad outcomes. Like, you get like, it's really hard for people
Yeah.
to. There was actually a great article from the addiction literature, actually, that was looking at sort of one thing that we did really well over the last 50 years is we moved addiction out of like the moral vice space.
Yeah.
People who are addicted are not in fact just like terrible, weak people. But in that same way, a lot of liberals sort of moved into like, well, it's a brain, like it's a
Mhm.
genetic predisposition and you have no control over it. And it
Yeah.
turns out that actually the best way to tackle addiction is to give people a sense of agency. Like, that
Oh,
actually,
wild. That's so
guess
cool.
what? You can, kick this habit. You actually can. But, and this goes to your point, you need the right support, you need the right social structure in place, you need the right like policy structures in place. And so, when I think about sort of like how we can put these pieces together, I think there's like a bunch of really hard things we have to do at the same time. There's, first of all, like the narrative to individuals that like, yes, like, you are an agent, you are a moral agent, you have choice, you have an incredible power to change your circumstances. But then I also think that like as policymakers and as elites, I mean, I'm sort of like putting us all into like the elite bucket in terms of people who care about both policy and sort of social psychology broadly, like we have a moral obligation to look at the systems that are actively harming people in the way that they use their agency, right? But it should never be either or, of course, because individuals operate in a social context. They operate in a policy context. But when I talk to a lot of a lot of my progressive friends, there was this kickback against, like, if you brought up the term responsibility or the term agency, people got very, very like upset, right? And then conservatives did it in the other direction, right? Like, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yeah.
Everything's fine, right? And it's like, well, that's not useful either.
Right. Right.
Totally.
It's Danielle, it's so motivated. That's what I think about. Like, this is a really good example of motivated perception, right? Which is like, I look at my life and I say, look at the things I have done for myself. Right. And like when things have gone well and when things have gone badly in somebody else's life, I say, look at what you've done to yourself. Right. But I don't look at my own life and say bad things that happen to me are because of my actions. And that's one of the things that I think is so fascinating about agency perceptions. Like, you even have illusory control, right? Where you see yourself as controlling things that are well outside of your sphere of influence. So it's like, in some ways, it benefits us as organisms to see and perceive where we have agency, but we can also get way off the rails with it, right? And use it in ways like you see with Republicans saying, yeah, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Look what I did, right? When I landed on third base. That's clearly what Democrats or liberals are reacting to.
Yeah.
And so, like, how do we keep agency perceptions rooted in reality and healthy? Or maybe we can't.
Yeah, I love the way you phrase that question, because it's exactly right. And you really only just have to look at the psychology literature to see the double-edged sword of agency, right? Because, as you say, as both of you alluded to, you can't really thrive or flourish if you don't have a sense of that your actions amount to something, that your choices matter, that you have a sense of agency. So it's a prerequisite of flourishing. At the same time, there's a ubiquitous human tendency to over-attribute agency to ourselves in self-serving ways, and this is the fundamental attribution error, right? Which is a term coined by Lee Ross in the 1970s, a famous psychologist, is that we have a tendency to attribute to other people their dispositions to their actions. So basically, we think that, if someone did something bad, if they cut me off in traffic, that's because they're a bad driver, right? Not because they were in a hurry. And so the answer to your question, Laura, I think is a nuanced and complex one. And then the answer is, we need to do the mental balancing act of keeping both of these values and ideas in our mind at the same time. There's no way around it. We need to be able to talk about the value of agency, and also constantly be checking ourselves and being aware of the ways in which our inherent biases can kick in self-serving ways, and just constantly sort of probing that and asking ourselves, okay, is this an instance in which I'm over-attributing to, my own success? Am I taking, more credit than I deserve? Am I overlooking all the ways in which luck and help from others have allowed me to get to where I am? So it really just has to be this double-edged sword that we're constantly keeping in mind, and we need to have our policies and our political rhetoric reflect this tension.
This reminds me of so we have a couple really good comments in the comments, and I just want to mention them really quickly. So we have that Chip making some really good, sorry, everyone, just so you know what I see, which is that, like, your comment gets reduced to like one line. So it actually takes me a while to sort of scroll. But Chip has some awesome stuff here, and Chip's doing a lot of awesome peace building stuff, domestic peace building, after a background in foreign policy peace building. He mentions Carol Dweck's work, and then Danielle actually mentions the hope theory, Snyder, 1994, where there's like 3 important things for developing hope: goal, agency, and pathways. And actually, I really like that, Daniela. The pathways, I think, is where the policy piece hits, right? So, you can have someone with enormous agency, and if the if the opportunities are not there, then they're stuck, right? And I think that's where, Daniel, a lot of your work in the Beacon Project sort of shows that, like, that is a narrative that Americans find really compelling, which is people have this really incredible power, but we owe it to people to give them the opportunity to use that agency in a meaningful way in their own lives.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think this goes one step beyond sort of, when we think about agency, typically, we kind of think about, okay, what can I do to sort of improve my own life? But what's interesting is that when in our survey work, we actually see a lot of really intense support for something that we call morally directed agency. And so the idea is, we're not just agents. The way we want to see the individual is not just an agent that has the capacity to improve their own lives, but it's also an individual or an agent with the capacity to use that agency in service of improving the lives of others, and in so doing, improving their own lives. So, and that sort of goes back to these age-old ideas about, like, you think of self-interest rightly understood, which is a phrase that was used by the historian Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1800s, talking about the idea that our self-interest is really bound up in the well-being of the people around us, and that when the people around us are thriving, that helps us to thrive. And so when you see people as having the capacity for morally directed agency, then the sort of the cycle becomes that what we want to do as a society is to create opportunities for people to exercise that agency in ways that both lift up the people around them, and then as a consequence of that also improves their own well-being. And so when we test questions about this idea of morally directed agency and the relationship between that and opportunity, you get sort of really broad agreement across all political groups. Republicans, Democrats, and Independents all sort of endorse this idea of providing opportunities for people to exercise morally directed agency. It's a really sort of promising idea that I think that speaks to some of these topics that we're covering, but also has roots in the way that, in sort of political philosophy in the American tradition.
Mhm. I mean,
So there,
I was going to say, like, it's interesting because I would love to think more about what that morally directed agency should look like, because one of the questions I have is, like, if we incentivize everybody to create projects of improving their communities, like, sometimes that goes awry, right? Like, people are like, you see, like, that kind of, like, there ought to be a law, right? Like, about everything. And you're like, well, maybe we don't need laws about all of these things, right? Like, not sure. And so I wonder, like, what that could look like. And I don't know, one of the things I thought about when I read that in the paper was, like, what it looks like for people in my community to be engaged in projects together. Because, like, it's interesting, actually, by being more self-interested and creating and building things that make our area nice, it almost, like, it almost, like, keeps us more on the rails as we work together. So, like, my community works together and picks up litter, or, like, we have a fall and a spring festival. It's like, it's selfish in a lot of ways, but it also is, like, it's that feeling of, like, you can make the things that you want in your community. And I feel like that's really empowering to people. And the people I know who do that, I know somebody who was like, you know what, it would be great to have a Christmas market like they do in Europe. And now my tiny town, has a Christmas market. We have, like, Glühwein, like German Glühwein, and stuff at night, and cookies, and the whole nine yards.
That's too
And
too cute. Stop.
yeah,
Too
there's
much-
some agency that
too
I
much
can get
cuteness.
behind. But it is, like,
What's your
selfish,
community?
right?
I'll go. I'll come
I'll
over there.
send everybody an invite. It's Pendleton, South Carolina. We
Cute.
may be the only town in South Carolina with a Christmas market.
You know, it reminds me of, I have two things, two responses to what you're saying. The first thing it does is it reminds me of, actually, so I live in New Orleans, and you know, as you know, Mardi Gras is a big thing here. And I am part of a crew of people that march in a Mardi Gras parade every year. And then, in fact, actually multiple parades leading up to the Mardi Gras day. So Mardi Gras, you think of Mardi Gras as a day, it's actually like a season, and there's a whole sort of set of things leading up to it. But obviously the parading is a big thing. So we march every year, and we put together this float, and we dress in costumes, and it's a whole sort of like thing. But one thing that I have remarked about is that when people talk about their participation in this group, they don't, it's obviously really fun, but there's an element in which they see it as almost as like like keeping the culture alive, and like almost like as a civic responsibility, where it's like we're marching because this is like we are contributing to the community by participating in this event. And so, you know, it's just an interesting way of thinking about how one sort of like, you know, the reasons why someone might want to march in a Mardi Gras parade, you know, like it's there's a lot of the self-interested aspect, but there's also a sense in which it's tied up with the well-being of the community. The other thing I wanted to say is, you know, back to your idea of saying this ought to be a law. I think what we're talking about culture. We're not talking about laws, right? When we talk about, we're talking about a culture of morally directed agency, of a culture of agency that we have to work to serve the benefit of others, and a cultural understanding of the ways in which the well-being of others is deeply tied to our own well-being. So I think, like, you know, when you think about changing culture, obviously, like there all the complexities and difficulties and challenges that arise when you think about what it means to change culture. But that exactly is why this is, number one, so important, but also so challenging, because that is what it requires. It requires a change in our culture about the way in which we see ourselves as individuals and as citizens.
So you mentioned, so to follow up on that, because what I was going to say is exactly that. I mean, if you look at Tocqueville, since you brought up Tocqueville, I'm going to jump on it. You know, I obviously spend a lot of time in my own writing thinking about sort of false binaries. And I think this is one of those things that we do fall into, this false binary of like, well, there's two ways of solving human problems. There's markets and there's government, right? There's laws, and then there's, you know, for profit, whatever. And like part of what democracy in America demonstrated is how powerfully associative humans are. Like, we just love getting together. Like and part of what he was talking about, like why he was so positive about the American experiment, is that at least at that point in American history, that kind of associative behavior had not been crowded out by either the market or government policies. And so you have this kind of ability that people, you know, if they want to raise a barn, you can't sit around waiting for a barn raising committee at the government level, right? People just meet on a Saturday and they raise a barn, right? And they're not charging for it, right? So there's this middle ground. And Elinor Ostrom is a huge influence on me. She's a lot of her work was looking at sort of these community innovations, right? Like how people solve problems without needing to resort to either sort of market or government actions. But Matt asked in the comments, you know, he said, like, how do we create opportunities for individuals and communities to discover that they have or can have such an agency? And I'll tell one funny story, and then I'm going to kick this to Danielle to ask what your thoughts are. So I'm from up Western New York. I'm in the Buffalo Bills, and we have Buffalo has an enormous amount of snow. We currently have an uncovered football stadium. And Buffalo fans go and they voluntarily shovel out this giant stadium before football games. Like, this is like a for-profit, like the Bills are like a major, right? Like, this is not, but it's, to Daniel's point, it's like, this is part of their culture. This is important to them. Like, football and the Bills and their incredible losing streak is like deeply, it's like part of our soul. And so people are like, it's just something that like people do, not because it's like super pleasant to shovel a stadium out from under 3 feet of snow, but because it provides that kind of community, you know, that sense of belonging, a sense of place. We had Seth Kaplan on a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of his work is looking at that. So Daniel, I don't know if has the Beacon Project looked at like ways to create opportunities to sort of create these kinds of like space for morally directed agency? Is that something you guys are thinking about?
Not at all. We have not looked into.
Sorry.
We have not studied that. But I will offer some reflections based on other research that I know about. Well, so just gonna say one. First of all, it sounds like really fun. Actually, I bet like it's hard, but like actually, I bet they have a great time because they're all out there with a shovel and like they're doing something, and they're helping people out. They're helping out. They're helping out the team.
Drinking. They're
Exactly.
drinking.
It sounds good. So yeah. So maybe we should just have beer. Like maybe that's the solution. And the other so another thought that came to mind is this concept of collective effervescence that was developed by Emil Durkheim like 100 years ago. But it's just this idea that people want to be part of something bigger than themselves. And some research that I've been involved in looks at ways for people to participate in collective activities that gives them this sense of collective effervescence, a sense of transcending the boundaries of your own self and seeing yourself as connected to something bigger, and the ways in which that can sort of break down the sort of limited conception of self-interest that we typically have and sort of make it more about the interest of the group, or to kind of expand our circle of moral concern to beyond ourselves. So, just kind of speculating about ways in which that would, I think that like, what you want are opportunities for people to engage in these types of activities that spark this sense of self-transcendence. Not in a in a grand way, but in small ways. If it has to I think it by definition has to be sort of bottom up. It needs to be something that it can't be imposed by some authority or from some board or from some leader. It needs to be sort of an organic, emergent property of the uncoordinated actions of different individuals that are all sort of like absorbing these types of values and acting on them in a way that sort of creates conditions for other people to do the same and sort of and lead. Presumably that's what kind of it means when culture changes, is that like culture changes when there can be some sort of eliciting or catalyzing event, but also culture changes in small ways when you have sort of individuals that are absorbing a particular set of values and then acting on them and then setting a precedent and a standard for other people to do the same and that sort of thing. So I think that those are the kinds of ways that those are sort of reliable conduits to change that I think we can be looking for.
Yeah, I think, I think you're absolutely right that it needs to be sort of bottom up. And I think it's a little bit like actually the term emergent order is like perfect. Like you can set the stage for it, but you can't make it happen, right? Like, so, but I think what I love about Seth Kaplan's work is how much he thinks about how you set the stage for it, right? If you have a downtown as opposed to lots of sprawl, like if you have a place that people can run into each other spontaneously, a local coffee shop, right? Robert Talisa's work right now is looking at that too. He's a political scientist. And, so finding spaces for people to come together. But then another thing Matt mentions in the comments is, right, spaces where people can actually consult on like what a community's needs are, right? Like we often think we know what our community needs, but sometimes you need to get everyone into the same room or at least the same like sort of space to talk about things. So it is tough because once you lose that, and I know this was a huge problem in New Orleans, right? Like after Hurricane Katrina, there was so much lost human capital that it was really, really hard to get that back. Like you can't, it's like this magic thing that you have that once you lose it, it's really, really tough to rebuild.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, like these are the geniuses, the urban planners and the architects that are creating spaces for the emergence of serendipity, right? Like, it's like you're and that I think is, yeah, far beyond my understanding, but I think that is exactly the kind of thing that we want to be creating our opportunities where serendipitous encounters and efforts can emerge.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about too, like this is something Americans are almost having to rediscover, because if you think about like life in Europe, right, where like you have dinner and then in many countries after dinner you go out and you walk around, you have a glass of wine and you have an espresso, and you bump into the community members in this public square, and information gets shared. And that's really important to activating people, right? And sort of saying, well, we need this. This is important. This is a problem. How are we going to address this? And it's something my neighborhood has, because we have a square, we have a public square. So I think like for all of this sort of techno optimism that the internet can be a public square, it doesn't actually translate very well into real life. And we didn't evolve to text each other information, right? Like sharing that social information is really important. And it's different face to face in ways that I think are hard for us to even catalog. So I feel like, you know, part of this is a physical in-person interaction that we need to be more aware of how it translates into agency. And actually getting back to the point about Seth, when we had him on the podcast, one of the things we talked about was like, well, we know in psychology people study the locuses of control, right? And so there's like internal locus of control and external locus of control. But I think what Seth was talking about and kind of what you're talking about is like, what does it look like to have a community locus of control where the orientation is, we can do this together?
Mm, yeah, I love that. That's a beautiful way of putting it.
So I have a follow-up question, which is so we know polarization's been rising for a long time. I think, the internet obviously played a big role in that. But now that we've been talking about sort of how hard it is to rebuild things after, or how hard it is to sort of rebuild spaces for morally directed agency, I'm wondering if any of your research or if you've looked at sort of how the pandemic played a role in this. I mean, I'm thinking of my own, like, I just got out of habits that I was in. I know that, I teach on a university, now I'm an administrator on a university campus. We cannot get students back on campus. Like it's like night and day. We bring in speakers that before the pandemic, we would have gotten full audiences for, and now it's like crickets. And it's really damaging. The students are really, really struggling to come together. They don't engage with each other. They don't engage with the campus life. And so I'm wondering if like the epidemic like just accelerated this process that was already happening. And so not only do we not have as many spaces for this morally directed agency, but we also have lost the habits of doing it in the first place.
Yeah. That's so troubling to hear. I mean, yeah. The analogy that comes into my mind is sort of like, when a hurricane comes through and you have the beach takes a particular shape, and then there's a permanent change in the shape of a beach, right? And then like, it like, or a river overflows its banks, and then like it actually creates the conditions for that new shape of the river to be sustained. It doesn't go back to its original shape. And I think something similar happened with the pandemic, and it's so sad. Like, there have been some like lovely consequences of the pandemic. I mean, like I live in New Orleans. I worked at a remote organization, and that gives me the opportunity to live in a city that I love and do the work that I love at the same time. And so that's been really nice. But I think especially for young people who have sort of, in their formative teenage years, from the age of like 16 to 14 to 16 or 10 to 12, like you're getting classes on Zoom, and then we know that those are times when people really form habits and practices that stay with them for the rest of their lives. And so it's really troubling to think about what long-term impact that might have for people who have become accustomed to the comforts of sitting at home watching a talk on your cell phone screen. And so then the idea of putting on your clothes and going out, if you could, I could just watch it in my pajamas. So like, why wouldn't I just do that?
Yeah.
Like, and so like, but there's something that, you know, it also just reminds me of, a slightly different idea that I've been discussing with some people recently, this idea of friction. So,
Mhm.
you know, basically every technological innovation is designed to reduce friction. It's designed to make things easier. It's designed to, uh, make it easier to order a cheeseburger, have a cheeseburger
Yeah.
delivered to my house, and I can order literally anything I want on Amazon and all of these things. But there's something so uh, paradoxical to this because well, friction makes our lives easier, but also a frictionless life is a meaningless life.
Mhm.
Friction is where we get the things that make life interesting. It's where that area of having to work for something. Another analogy that just came to mind is my sister and her partner are basically rebuilding or sort of bought a fixer upper and are like just basically installing so much in their house. They had to reinstall the kitchen cabinets and they had to repaint the walls and they had to redo the floor. And every one of these projects that they've done now just permanently sparks joy for them because they're like, I put in 10 hours of work into like making this kitchen cabinet. And that's the joy of friction. And so like how we sort of navigate this, I don't think that it has, as a society, we've yet figured out what the antidote to this sort of frictionless technological world is, and how do we sort of restore and sort of put prioritize and create opportunities to experience the kind of friction that
Mhm.
leads to a more flourishing life.
Yeah, that friction, the interesting thing about it is like you develop a tolerance for the friction, right? Like the less you experience, the more grating it is. And that's why, I talk to younger people who are like, no, I'm not going to order food from any place where I have to call in. Like
Right.
it's got to be through the app. I can't talk to a person.
Yeah,
And
God
right, like
forbid
you
you
can
have to talk on
yeah,
the phone.
so you can get accustomed to this. And I think it creates this illusion that like what in-person interaction should be like is also frictionless. Right. And so it's like, no, I don't want to go talk to the neighbors because I know they voted differently than I did. And I just can't stand to have to talk to people like that. Right. It's this
Mhm.
expectation that's not reasonable. But like the other thing I want to say is as somebody who's really excited by social cognition, you already have the original software for friction reduction when dealing with other people, which is like this whole host of cognitive abilities that let you get along with other people as kind of a default. You understand them and intuit what they want and intend without even consciously intending to. Like I promise you, you were born with skills for social interaction that you don't even know you have. It's not as much friction as you think it is. Go for a walk in your neighborhood and talk to the neighbors so you guys can get some effervescence and like, start making life better and be high agency people.
Well,
That's
also,
right.
so did you find this, Daniel? So one of the things, like I had pretty bad. I think I was sort of born in, what are we, like, Gen Alpha? What's the current, like, we won't talk
Oh,
about
the current
that.
ones are
Like,
the
yeah,
youngest is Gen Alpha.
mine, yeah. So my kids are Alpha. Anyway, so they don't want to talk to people on the phone. They don't want to actually talk to people face to face. So, but I will. I'm actually like very sympathetic to this because if my husband listens to this episode, he'll be like, "You do not leave the house unless you absolutely have to," which is why it's probably good that I'm like in an administrative job and I have to leave the house. Um, but one of the things that really helped me because I really, really struggled with this, like I didn't feel like I had the skills. So one of the things that I did is, and this, the only reason I did this is that I did it with friends. I moved after college to South America, Ecuador in particular. And so like what I did is I took myself from this like environment that was like medium friction and just threw myself into the highest possible friction environment. And it really was like sort of, you just have to learn to swim. And so I wasn't very good at the language. I knew a little bit of Spanish, not very much Spanish. I went to some weird eco resort to do like volunteer work for a month, and had to learn that like the entire coastal Spanish is completely different than normal Spanish. And so like I couldn't speak that version of Spanish. But I had to like catch buses that then dropped me off at weird places where a pickup truck would eventually come and pick me up to get out there. Like all of this like deep friction, like it helps you build those muscles. And then when you come back to sort of regular life, everything feels much less frictionless. Like social interactions feel like, oh my gosh, I could do this all day long because it's in my native language. Right, with people who who are not yelling random things at me out of a bus window. And so, but I think that's something we're losing too. But I don't know, for me, I think international travel is a huge, like it's a way that you can flex that muscle, at least the right, specific types of international travel. But I think you do have to practice really going into high friction environments and then sort of going back to your normal life in order to, again, sort of, it's like weightlifting, you've got to create that progressive overload, or you're not going to get it. And I think a lot of students aren't getting it right now.
Absolutely, and our expectations contract to match our environment, right? So
Yeah.
it feels if you've never lifted weights, then lifting a 5-pound weight feels feels super heavy, or talking to someone on the phone feels extremely kind of socially intense. But it's just, exactly as you say, our muscles have atrophied, and so what we perceive to be a very difficult social interaction can in relative terms be extremely easy if you have a lot of experiences with other more difficult things. So I totally agree with that. And it was just occurring to me, I mean, it kind of goes back to like service here, right? Like service, like this is something that people have had, that's been floated around by some of our colleagues at More in Common, as just the amazing advantages that could happen if you had, required some sort of year of service, or even a summer of service. Like, it doesn't like, and get these 18-year-olds out of their comfort zone a little bit and have them talking to people that are different from them and cultivating a sense of what it means to do real work on behalf of a community. I just think there's a lot to be said for that sort of thing, and especially in this context.
Yeah. I did AmeriCorps in college as well, and we just studied it. So that's another lost opportunity. So
Cool.
sorry to bring us down.
Well, as we talk about all this, one of the questions we ask on the show is how does your work impact your parenting? And so I'm wondering, like, I think your child is a young child, but like, as you are like doing parenting even now, like, how do you think about agency in your kid?
Yeah. So I have a 3-year-old, and so she is exploring her agency in various limited and somewhat annoying ways sometimes. Like right now, her
Social
agency,
ways.
her agency really, like most of her agency consists in being really good at saying no. So, but you know what? Good, more power to her. Great. So, but I think that like, as any good parent knows that like, that helping your child learn to make good decisions on their own and not feel as though they are, it's not that the path is just set for them, but they actually need to be able to come to that conclusion and that decision by themselves. It's not like clean your room. It's like, well, what do we need to do before we can leave our room? Oh, we have to make sure the room is clean, that sort of thing. And so cultivating or fostering a sense of autonomy, even and decision making, even at a really early age, I think is something that I keep in mind. And then I think also like just accepting different ways of, I'm sort of thinking about this and seeing if it has any direct ties to my research. I was just sort of thinking about um, understanding the different pathways to development and the different ways that some children are good at this and not good at that, and other kids are good at that. And so, and it's very asymmetrical, and it's very irregular, and it's very sort of, um, uh, it's very difficult to predict, and what they're like now has really no bearing on what they're going to be like a year from now. And so, I actually don't know if that has anything to do with my research, but it was just another thought that I had about the journey of parenting.
Mhm.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, one possible connection is just one thing I've noticed is how little my parenting seems to, like in very broad, right, in a very broad sense, obviously, like my parenting is having some impact on my kids, but it's not having like a lot of impact on my kids. And so I think there's a phrase I've been playing with a lot more lately for a deep pluralism. I think it points us to like how little control we have over other people. And in particular, like even the people who are the closest to us, who we do actually have like sort of a broad legal power to direct in certain ways, like we actually don't have as much control over them as we think we do. And so I think kids are a lot like communities in the sense that you create a kind of framework for them to emerge in whatever way they're going to emerge. But it really is not, it's not top down. It's like kids are sort of fundamentally bottom up.
I love
Yeah.
that. That's a great insight. And I think it's particularly true for parents who have multiple kids. I don't know if either of you have multiple kids, but
Yeah.
I only have one, but what I have learned from my friends with multiple kids, is that you get a direct lesson in the power of the genetic lottery, and also a direct lesson in your powerlessness to shape that lottery, and that like you're kind of just along for the ride to kind of figure out what the kind of person they're going to become. There's little tweaks that you can make, but like a lot of it is sort of, you're just sort of like there being like, wow, okay, I guess this is the person that you're going to be. So.
Yep.
Yeah, I kind of look at it like trying to wrap agency around like who that kernel is of who they are. So like instead of trying to make them into who I think they should be, like really seeing what their strengths are and what their passions are, and giving them the tools to, sort of like put a big lever on that, right? And be like, okay, how can I be really effective around the things that matter to me and are important to me? So
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
love that.
sometimes it backfires. You don't always want an agentic 6-year-old. So or 3-year-old.
Yeah.
But yeah. You have
That's
you have our
right.
sympathy. We've
Yeah,
been there
you've been
with
there.
the 3-year-old.
Yeah. How old are your kids?
I have 13, 10, and 6.
Oh, wow.
Ours are almost the exact
Mine's
same, 13, 10, and 7. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're farther along than I am.
Yeah, it gets like easier in some ways and then way more complicated in other ways. So it's an interesting, like as soon as you think you figured it out, you're like, oh no, I didn't. But
right.
it's always
Uh,
fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
Well, we're almost out of time. I would love to hear. So usually we end on a couple, we ask people what they're feeling optimistic about right now. But then I also want to hear from, if you can let people know where to find your work. We'll put it all in the show notes and stuff. But the stuff that the Beacon Project is doing is, I think, absolutely fascinating. And I really, really love the model. And I love a lot of the things that you guys are sort of working toward. So I don't know if you want to let us know what's next for the Beacon Project, and then maybe we can end on like what you're feeling optimistic about. Does that make sense, Laura?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. So what are we working on at the Beacon Project right now? Well, we have a couple different projects. The one that I am most excited about is that we are going to be rolling out over the next couple months some sort of concrete articulations of this framework that we've been talking about, and kind of just. And it will be coming out through a series of Substack posts. So I would love if the people who are listening on the call want to follow along with that and kind of engage with it. Tell me what you think, and leave comments. And because we're in the early stages of kind of taking this from early phases to introducing it to a slightly broader audience and getting feedback on it. So to do that, I would go to thebeaconproject.substack.com. That's just where the Substack is. So that will be coming in the next few weeks to months. The other thing, so if you want to learn more about the Beacon Project, I would go to thebeaconproject.us. That's just where the general homepage of the Beacon Project is. That's where all of our projects are housed and where you can learn more about what we're doing. And then the other sort of project that I would just tell you about is we're going to be releasing in a couple months a user-friendly website that looks at how Americans think about civic responsibility. So we ask people, what are your responsibilities as an American citizen? And people said, paying your taxes and serving on a jury and obeying the law. But then people also said things like protecting the environment or following the news or being grateful for your opportunities. And so there are all these additional responsibilities that people are thinking about that I think that vary really interestingly across demographic groups and across geography and things like that. So we're going to be releasing a public-facing website where people can explore how our survey participants, we collected 5,000 Americans, asked them a bunch of these questions about civic responsibility, and you can kind of play around with the data and see how responses about civic responsibility differed across demographics, and you can also compare how your responses to these questions compare to the average American.
Cool.
And so that will be coming out in around October 15th, something like that.
Awesome. Is that related to the, I was looking around on the Beacon Project. There's a really cool part of this that looks at the, what is it? Theories of obligation. And there's like an analysis of am I the asshole?
Yeah. That's right. It is not related to that. It is a intellectual cousin of that
Okay.
project, but it is not the same, really.
Like,
that we didn't get a chance to talk about that, but maybe some other time we can. We just the 20-second version of that is that my collaborators and I, there's a really interesting forum on Reddit called "Am I the Asshole?" where people write in about whether or not they're the asshole, and then other users say yes you are, no you're not. And so what is an opportunity to do is explore hundreds of thousands of these posts about these everyday moral dilemmas, and then see what are the qualities of those dilemmas that lead people to say that you are the asshole versus that you're not. And so we just published a study in the journal PNAS Nexus that came out in May that was sort of a full analysis of this data repository and what does it mean for everyday moral experience.
Oh, that's cool. I got to take a look at that. We can link to it.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
It was a fun one.
Yeah. That does look cool. Well, what are you optimistic about? What can you leave our intrepid listeners with?
Well, this is a weird one, but there's so much chaos happening from our current political administration, and that has caused there's been so many bad consequences of that chaos. But one thing that makes me optimistic about it is that there's in this chaos, I see possibility, because what it means is an opportunity to really kind of think differently about what it means to be an American and what this country can actually do in the new era that we're in. And I think it's opened a lot of doors for thinking creatively about how to think and talk about our biggest challenges in a way that doesn't succumb to the typical approaches that are kind of tired at this point. There are doors being opened for new ways of imagining what it means to be an American, and that I think is and also a need for new ways of imagining what it means to be American. I think that that simultaneous opportunity and need is exciting to me, even though in the moment right now it feels it can be pretty sort of hopeless feeling. But I see in the longer term a lot of reason for hope and optimism about what we can do.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, me too. Well, thank you everyone for joining. This was our largest listener, like live
Yeah.
listeners yet. So thank you for joining us, Daniel. This was fantastic. Carol says just in time for America's 250th. I'm actually
That's it.
very
Perfect
excited about
timing.
conversations about that too. We will have all of the information on how to find Daniel and all the amazing research that the Beacon Project is doing in the show notes. Any last thoughts, Laura, before we sign off?
Nope. Just thanks for joining us today. This has been a really fun conversation.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for having me, both of you.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel. Bye, everyone.
You've been listening to We Made This Political with Laura Forcum and Lauren Hall. You can find us on Substack, Instagram, or LinkedIn. The podcast Substack is We Made This Political. Laura's Substack is How to Human, and Lauren's Substack is The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life. Subscribe and share if you like what you hear, and please also rate and review on your favorite podcast platform. That really, really helps other people find our work and means a lot to us too. Thanks for listening.